Thank you, Navy Band Southwest. Would all of our guests please rise for the official arrival? Naval operations arriving. Our Joint Service Color Guard will now present the colors. Present the colors. Ladies and gentlemen, please join in the singing of our national anthem with the Navy Region Band Southwest. Retire the colors. Side boys post. Chaplain Tim Eichler, Captain United States Navy, will present the invocation.
Please join with me in a word of prayer. Gracious Lord God, be present at our commemoration today as we give thanks and praise to you and those who at a tiny atoll halfway between America and Japan 75 years ago put service before self, manifesting the fighting spirit of the Navy in their bravery, sacrifice, steadfast determination and ingenuity, elements of the human spirit, elements of a fighting spirit, elements of hope. As the military strategist Basil Lindell Hart said, it is the loss of hope rather than the loss of life that decides the issues of war. Midway, Lord, gave our nation that hope. Hope immortalized during those days as an attitude that reflected our own history that comes out of the Battle of Lake Erie in 1813, and don't give up the ship. Lord, for those who have gone before us, who have gone down to the sea in ships, for their fighting spirit, their families, we give you thanks and praise. As we commemorate their service before self, bless us with your presence this day, that the fighting spirit of Midway, the fighting spirit of our armed forces, may be service before self, be our spirit as well. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Please be seated. Well, on behalf of your United States Navy hosts, the USS Midway Museum Board of Directors, all the great Americans in attendance here today, thank you all for joining us for the 75th commemoration of the great Navy Battle of Victory, the Navy Battle of Midway Victory. I'd like to welcome our Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral John Richardson, Commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Admiral Scott Swift, Vice Admiral Nora Tyson, Vice Admiral Tom Roden, Vice Admiral Mike Shoemaker, Rear Admiral Tim Szymanski, Rear Admiral Yancey Lindsay, the U.S. Fish Wildlife Service representatives that are here with us today, distinguished guests, community leaders, and most importantly, the young sailors and young officers that will sit here today and take a little time out of their day to understand what the legacy of service is that they truly inherit, and who those of us who are retired expect them to be, and what kind of future leaders we expect them to groom in the future years of our great United States Navy. Ladies and gentlemen, to kick off the ceremony, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you, over underneath the blue Midway awning, our Battle of Midway veterans who are with us this morning. Thank you. They've been waiting 75 years for that kind of applause, and I'm sure it was worth the wait. The United States was forever changed. I'm not sure if this is a scheduled event or an unscheduled event, but before we hear the mighty roar of some jet aircraft perhaps, here comes my community, those ugly helicopters that beat the air into submission, our United States Navy helicopter squadrons. Some things never change. We failed to get the word back in my day, too. But I'm sure the Air Boss is going to handle that as soon as the ceremony's over. On that day in June of 1942, the entire history of our nation was rewritten because of our heroes sitting over there. You're an incredible model of heroism for all of us. I know all the young sailors want to shake your hand and hear your story and inherit a little bit of your DNA. I'd now like to call the individual names of those veterans, and if they would just rise or raise their hands so they can all be acknowledged as we go through the list here. Lieutenant Commander Jeffrey A.L. Blackman, raising his hand. I happen to know that Jeff is a Catalina pilot in the VP squadron, and just for public dissemination, he gets on me daily about not having a VP aircraft on the flight deck of Midway. But Jeff, as I always tell you, we'll work on it. We'll see what we can do. Aviation Radioman Third Class Ronald W. Grates. Mr. Grates. I was talking with the Grates family. They said, came out of the hospital this morning to be here for this ceremony, and then he'll return afterwards. Lieutenant Commander Rudy Matz. Chief Steward Andy Mills, who is using his age of 102 as an excuse for missing this morning's ceremony. Aviation Radioman First Class Charles Monroe. And Commander Ellis D. Skidmore in uniform. Additionally, Captain Francis S. Knight and Aviation Chief Machinist Mate Joseph Lee Waller were veterans at the Battle of Midway, but they were unable to attend today. Their families are here to represent them. Ladies and gentlemen, please, one final round of applause and thanks to the heroes of the Battle of Midway. I'm moving along very fast today. And I have to show you one of the reasons is because this is the best audience we've ever had for the Battle of Midway commemoration. And I think the reason is because we did it with breakfast and you all still aren't at the bar. I noticed people took their seats quicker. Usually we're at this point in the ceremony and we're yelling, hey, yoo-hoo! We've commenced the ceremony as they come away from happy hour. So maybe this will be a new tradition. It seems to be working. And I'm on a little bit of a time thing for some very special things that we have planned. Well, welcome to the 75th commemoration of the victory at Midway. It's a unique opportunity to experience the legacy of this landmark battle. A live broadcast from Midway Atoll later on for your enjoyment up on the flight deck. A brief memorial ceremony. Our fish and wildlife leadership is here. And most importantly, a comment from our Chief of Naval Operations. I've noticed since I retired and sit up here, I just remember being in the Navy and the chiefs of naval operation always look like such old, grizzly guys. And now I'm feeling old and grizzly as I look down at these young four-stars. It's truly remarkable, but we've got great leadership in our Navy, as you know, and Admiral Richardson will be here a little later on. Over here a little later on. He's already here. My cue is telling me I have 5 minutes, and I have 5 minutes of jokes, but my director of marketing said, Mac, you might not want to use those at this particular ceremony. I want to share with all of you that all of San Diego is really celebrating the fact that your aircraft carrier, USS Midway, is here and what it's doing for all of us and what it's becoming for our young Navy people. We do 450 re-enlistment ceremonies, active duty commissionings, changes of command up here, and all of our active duty think we're such great hosts for being willing to do a lot of that stuff free of charge, unless you want to have a reception. But I'm going to share with you my honest sentiments about this. It's not that we're good people. We love having live exhibits here on the ship. And we have a very static delivery here with these cold aircraft and the ship. But when you bring these young men and women to our flight deck and have a ceremony, trust me, it might be something that all of you take for granted. But our visitors from Iowa and New Hampshire and Georgia, if you're a sailor and you want to be a rock star, come here during the summer. You will sign autographs for most of your day. And I think that's a very good thing, that your fellow citizens love you guys that much and know what you're doing. It's significantly different America these days that is here to celebrate your willingness to serve, sacrifice your lives so that they can enjoy the good life here in America. And on behalf of our retired community here in San Diego, we feel the same way. Thank you all for being who you are and maintaining our freedoms at the outer boundaries, as Nimitz is getting ready to do right now. This is a great Navy town, and that's why the Midway is so successful. 1.4 million visitors last year, increasing visitorship every year. 250 after-hour events on the Midway. People rent this to have cocktails. One of our major milestones was reached 2 years ago. Over $1 million in alcohol sales. My staff likes to call us the partyingest ship in the Navy. And that's okay, because that's okay here, but not over where you all serve and sacrifice. It's unique in San Diego. It's a Navy town, it's a Marine Corps town, and this is getting to be quite an icon in just 10 years. So thank you all, San Diego, for making it so, because it couldn't be done in any other city other than San Diego, right here. I've got a little something that I'm trying to get. You know, when Governor Wilson was the mayor here, he dubbed San Diego America's finest city, and that's a good name. We agree. It is America's finest city, but it's also America's most patriotic city on the west coast of America. Now, we'll never compete with Boston and Lexington and Concord. And we don't want to compete with those folks because they're pretty nasty. They could get, you know, they could get upset and come back at us, you know. And we don't want that. I know. I went to high school in Rhode Island. And when my wife, who's a Southern California girl, came to visit my friends on the plane ride back, she said, "Who were those people?" She said, "They should call that place Rude Island." It's a true story, so we don't want to upset them at all or upstage them. But in a couple of minutes, we are going to have the benefit. I don't know if it's going to be a flyby or a flyover, but unlike the previous very disrupting sound of rotor blades meshing, you will hear the ultimate sound of Navy tactical aviation power as a couple of FNA-18 Hornets from VX-9 give us an overflight. So normally you can see them. I'm not sure if they're going to be able to get below the... Oh, here they come, Air Boss. They're underneath the bridge. They're... No. I think they're going to make it. But the flyover should be coming. We're going to signal Charlie. They're inbound, and then we will continue with this morning's event. One-minute call. Commander, Navy Region Southwest is up here lobbying that we hear something from his band, like, which if it was less than a minute, I'd welcome it because they're terrific. I hear something. If you want to stand up, it's fine. I think they're going to do a flyover the... You know, Vice Admiral Shoemaker is right down here in front, so I got to watch his nonverbal communications. And when I said, oh, here they come under the bridge, he had this head-in-hand reaction. He looks much happier now. You know, for the aviators in the audience, you know, days like today with a scheduled flyover for a major milestone really give those kids up there the opportunity to get real stupid. And they didn't. They did the right thing. I'm sorry we missed the flyover, but I'm glad they got here anyways, safe and sound. So ladies and gentlemen, as is often the case, the price for the victory at Midway was very, very expensive. It's most appropriate that we always honor and never forget the sacrifice and valor of those men who gave all on that fateful battle day. At this very moment, we are joining Midway veterans and audience in simultaneous celebrations from all these great places. And by the way, for those of you that are traveling, you need to visit all of these places. They're great representations for all of you and what we represent. The U.S. Navy Memorial on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. is watching you live. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans, super place if you haven't visited down there. The National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, our flagship museum amongst naval aviation. The National Museum of the Pacific War, honoring Chester Nimitz in his hometown of Fredericksburg, Texas. Take a day when you're down in San Antonio and go to Fredericksburg and visit them. The Valor in the Pacific Park in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and the Navy ships and installations around the world via the American Forces Network. And now we are about to join live the Midway Atoll, where the Battle of Midway occurred, and to pay homage to those who fought and won peace in the Pacific for all of us. Over to the Midway Atoll for this most special broadcast to honor the men who fought and earned the victory of the Allied forces, the acting director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Mr. Jim Kurth, will lead off the broadcast. Over to you, Mr. Kurth, on Midway.
Good morning. I want to thank all of those who are joining us from across the United States and around the world on this auspicious and solemn day. On this small patch of sand and coral located roughly halfway between the west coast of the United States and the eastern edge of Asia, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages Midway Atoll National Wildlife Refuge and National Memorial, easily one of the most remote of the 566 units of America's National Wildlife Refuge System. Our commitment to the fish and wildlife and their habitat here is accompanied by the honor
Mr. Kurth,
and
if you can hear us on the
of managing the Battle of Midway National Memorial, which recognizes in perpetuity the importance of the Battle of Midway that took place over several pivotal days in June of 1942. We are proud to stand with the United States Navy to commemorate those historic efforts by sponsoring ceremonies across the United States, particularly here in the company of two of the battle's veterans. Located in the heart of Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument, This isolated Pacific atoll is the epicenter of one of the most important battles in our nation's history and the turning point in World War II in the Pacific. The calm of the oceans and sky were replaced by the sounds and sights of ferocious warfare that history properly remembers for the commitment, steadfastness, and bravery. Success at the Battle of Midway reflects the actions of those who were here on those June days, on islands, on ships, and in planes. It also reflects on many more who contributed from afar, repairing warships, breaking codes, and working ceaselessly to mobilize the valiant front lines. Many served, many perished. We honor all who won the Battle of Midway 75 years ago, and we honor all the men and women in armed services today who carry forward the tradition of duty and dedication for the safety and security of the United States of America. It's my privilege now to introduce Rear Admiral Samuel J. Cox, U.S. Navy retired, who serves as the Director of the Naval History and Heritage Command and Curator of the U.S. Navy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director Kurth. Honored veterans, ladies and gentlemen. 75 years ago, at this hour, yesterday, this island had just been attacked by 108 aircraft from 4 aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. On a 6-month victory spree, the Japanese expected to achieve surprise. They, however, were surprised to find over 3,000 United States Marines heavily fortified and dug in, who had made a pact among themselves that no matter what happened, there would be no surrender at Midway Island. The Japanese were also surprised to find 127 aircraft already here, and everyone that could fly was already airborne thanks to the early warning provided by Navy Catalina patrol planes flying out of the lagoon here. Overnight, one of those Catalinas had hit a Japanese tanker with a torpedo, the first blow of the war. The Marine fighters that were based here were outclassed by the technologically superior Japanese fighters, but did not hesitate to attack the strike force, shooting down several Japanese bombers before the fighters turned the tables, and in the end, almost all the Marine fighters were either shot down or heavily damaged. Only 2 would remain flyable of the 28 at the end. But the sacrifice of the Marine fighters and the intense anti-aircraft fire from the defenders on the island hit almost half the Japanese strike force, shooting down 11 aircraft, heavily damaging 14 others. And those losses would prove critical in the last stages of the battle when the last-ditch Japanese attempt to hit the U.S. carriers. Instead of having 18 torpedo bombers, they only had 10 left. And had the U.S. aircraft carrier Yorktown taken one more torpedo hit than she did, she probably would have gone down in a matter of minutes with most of her crew, rather staying afloat for 2 days. But also at the same time, strike aircraft from Midway Island had just reached the Japanese carriers, 6 Navy TBF torpedo planes and 4 U.S. Army Air Force twin-engine B-26 bombers armed with torpedoes. They ran into 30 Japanese fighters, but not one of those torpedo planes turned away. They were a new type of aircraft that the Japanese had never seen before and proved incredibly difficult to shoot down. In fact, they shot down 2 Japanese fighters first. The Japanese, increasingly desperate to bring the bombers down, had to fly into their own shipboard anti-aircraft fire to do so. 2 of the Navy torpedo bombers got close enough to fire torpedoes at the Japanese aircraft carrier Hiryu, and another one fired at a Japanese light cruiser. Only one of those 6 planes made it back to Midway Island. And of the 4 Air Force B-26s, 1 was shot down, 2 dropped torpedoes against the flagship of the Japanese force, the Akagi, which missed, but one of the planes strafed the Akagi's flight deck, and the 3rd plane, whether it was uncontrollable or whether the pilot deliberately tried to crash his crippled aircraft into the Akagi, missed the bridge of that ship by a matter of feet, sparing the lives of Admiral Nagumo, who was the commander of the Japanese task force. But the result of that strike and the losses incurred at Midway Island caused Admiral Nagumo to initiate a series of decisions that eventually resulted in disaster for the Japanese fleet. Because what at this hour he did not know was that 117 strike aircraft were already launching from the U.S. aircraft carriers Hornet and Enterprise, and 35 more from the Yorktown would follow shortly thereafter. Before those planes got there, another wave of 27 Marine bombers, dive bombers from this island reached the Japanese fleet, along with a dozen Army Air Force B-17s. The Marines suffered heavily. Half of them were lost. None of them were able to score any hits, but what they did was keep the Japanese from launching their counterstrike force. And then the first torpedo bombers, 3 squadrons from the aircraft carriers arrived. And of those 41 aircraft, only 6 made it back to the U.S. aircraft carriers. The sacrifice of those aircraft from Midway and from the carriers was not planned. That's just how it happened. But what they did is kept the Japanese from launching their aircraft, and at 10:20, 48 U.S. dive bombers arrived over the Japanese fleet, and in 5 minutes changed the course of the entire war and changed the course of history. The Japanese made one major mistake in leading up to the battle. In their own operations order, they said that the enemy lacks the will to fight. Well, the enemy, which was the U.S. forces on this island and the ships at sea, showed that they were not only willing to fight, but they would press forward in the face of overwhelming odds, and despite staggering losses, not one of those strike aircraft turned away. They either dropped bombs attempting to hit their target, or they were shot down trying, but again, none of them turned away. So that sacrifice and that valor at a time of perhaps our nation's greatest peril, those who made the ultimate sacrifice in that battle have more than earned the eternal gratitude of our nation. So in honor of the memory of those who made the ultimate sacrifice, we will now lay a wreath in their honor. Honor Guard, post. Hand salute. Ready, 2. Ladies and gentlemen, we commemorate this battle. We do not celebrate it. 3,000 Japanese sailors lost their lives. And although we were bitter foes at the time, for many years now, Japan has been a close friend and ally of the United States. But 307 Americans were killed in the battle. Many more were wounded, some of those grievously. We do not know for sure how many died in the months and years later from their wounds or from the effects of post-traumatic stress. And 307 may seem like a reasonable price to pay for a victory of this magnitude. But for the families, that's not the case. So in memory of everyone who suffered as a result of this battle, I would ask that all of you join me in a moment of silence, followed by a singing of the Navy hymn. Thank you.
Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arm hath bound the restless wave, who bids the mighty ocean deep his own appointed limits keep. Oh, hear us when we cry to thee, for those in peril on the sea.
And now Midway is honored to welcome the 31st Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral John Richardson.
Well, good morning to everybody, and welcome to the USS Midway. I want to thank everybody for really the honor and the privilege of being able to speak to you today at today's commemoration. And in the interest of just sort of both recognizing the people that we have in the audience today, and also as a chance to warm up a bit on this teeth-chattering June morning in San Diego, I just wanted to, I think, round of applause. We'll get the blood stirring here a little bit for the Navy Band here and the Color Guard. They give everything that touch of dignity that's so appropriate here on Midway today. I'd like to also recognize all of our active duty members here this morning. It is completely appropriate that today, in fact, where else would you want to be on a day that celebrates the victory at the Battle of Midway than on the USS Midway? I'd ask all of our folks on active duty right now to stand and for everybody to recognize those. Team, stand up. And I think that we'd all agree that we come here not only to take part in this, but also to gather inspiration. There are many of us here, some good friends who are veterans, who have done their time on active duty, and are now left the service or retired. Could I have all of our veterans who serve stand and be recognized as well, please? Thank you all so much for your service and your sacrifice for our nation's freedom. There's a special group of families among us, and I just wanted to recognize those. And Admiral Swift did a terrific job recognizing them each individually, but could all of the family members who are representing veterans of the Battle of Midway, could you all please stand and be recognized? Thank you all so much for being here and sharing this day with us, and for the sacrifices that your family has made. As Admiral Cox said, you know, the echoes of this battle lives on in our families. And finally, I know we've been saving our best round of applause one more time for our Midway veterans who are here with us today. So let's really give it up for them. Absolutely fantastic that you could be with us here, men. Thanks for joining us. You know, this year marks the anniversary of a lot of important dates in the history of the United States. It's the 100th anniversary of our entry into the First World War. It's the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War. But of course, we are celebrating, as has been said, the 75th anniversary of so many pivotal events in World War II, and that's what brings us together today. The 75th anniversary of the Battle of Midway, which by any measure would have to rank as, if not the top battle in the history of naval battles around the world. And so it is so appropriate that we in the United States Navy take some time every year to get together, gather together, and just think about what this battle teaches us. And you've heard many people talk about different aspects of the Battle of Midway already this morning. You know, Admiral Cox did a terrific job from the Midway Atoll itself. But I'd like to provide maybe just one more narrative, one perspective, a timeline that demonstrates that in the business of war and in the business of this battle, and indeed in the business of national defense, the margins of victory are almost always razor thin. So thin that we all, every one of us, must give our all in every endeavor, in every situation. We must never give up. Fight to our last measure to guarantee our freedom. So many battles, and especially Midway, demonstrate that it's almost impossible to know in advance what action, what seemingly small event, almost mundane at the time, even ineffective. You know, you may think that hey, that didn't amount to anything, that actually didn't work. But in the aggregate, these things turn out to be not only effective, but decisive. And in hindsight, when you review the Battle of Midway, it could seem like a series of strokes of amazing luck. And when you put those strokes together, it's like a miracle occurred at Midway. It trends towards the miraculous. And I'd just like to maybe piece together a couple of those strokes of luck and demonstrate that so much hang on a razor-thin balance. The first stroke, and you've heard about it already, is that we had broken the Japanese code. And like any good military operation, success at Midway was enabled by a very accurate intelligence picture. Station Hypo, visited by Admiral Swift just recently, the shorthand term to describe the U.S. Navy's code-breaking effort and signals intelligence operations embedded in the Pacific Command in Pearl Harbor. And Commander Joe Rochefort and Lieutenant Commander Ed Layton routinely passed information from this effort directly to the Pacific Fleet Commander, Admiral Nimitz. And Nimitz believed that commanders needed to talk directly to these intelligence folks, get it directly from the source, unfiltered. And he had challenged his intel officer, Lieutenant Commander Layton, to do his very best to think like Admiral Yamamoto. provide estimates, his best estimates, for where he thought the Japanese fleet might maneuver. And in the end, they were spectacular. Nimitz himself said that in predicting where the Japanese fleet would be, they were off by only 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles. That's not bad predicting. That gave Nimitz, their work gave Nimitz the confidence he needed to issue the operations plan, which directed Enterprise and Hornet to proceed to Midway, with Yorktown to follow. Now, on the other side, the Japanese had several intelligence signals as well. They ignored key signals, key factors that would have given them some insight that the United States was actually onto this operation. They ignored those at their peril. To summarize the efforts of the intelligence team that provided this prediction of the Battle of Midway, Captain Ned Beach best summarized it in his book, The United States Navy, 200 Years, and I'll quote, "To Commander Joe Rochefort must forever go the acclaim for having made more difference at a more important time than any other naval officer in history." That's some pretty high praise. I'll go to the second stroke of luck, the USS Yorktown. And you've got to ask the question, what was Yorktown even doing at the battle? I mean, she had just participated in the Battle of Coral Sea, and she had been severely damaged in that battle. She pulled into Pearl Harbor for repairs. Under normal conditions, the repairs would have been extensive. But the team in the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, our citizen sailors that Admiral Swift referred to earlier, which had demonstrated such bravery during the attack on Pearl Harbor, again rose to the occasion, showed their patriotism, their skill, and their mettle. And they turned to and repaired Yorktown in 2 to 3 days instead of the projected 2 to 3 months that it would have taken in the normal time. That was an amazing feat to turn that ship around. Now you compare it again to the enemy. The Japanese had also suffered casualties at the Battle of Coral Sea. They had 2 carriers that went back for repairs. And by contrast, they were not able to turn those ships around and get them out to sea. This asymmetry, the bravery and the dedication and the effectiveness of the team in the shipyard set the stage for the fight. And so as we closed for the battle, the matchup was 3 United States carriers against 4 Japanese carriers, instead of what might easily have been 2 U.S. carriers against 6 Japanese carriers. That would have been a much different fight. And not only did Yorktown show up, but she was decisive. The most experienced carrier in the group by virtue of her time at Coral Sea, launching critical strikes against the enemy, and her crew demonstrated incredible toughness, fighting extensive damage from the attacks to stay in the fight. This required this re-attacking the Yorktown when she seemingly seemed lost but fought back required tremendous resources from the enemy, resources that easily would have been spent on other ships and aircraft in the group had Yorktown not been so tough before she was eventually lost to a Japanese submarine attack. So you start to see how this thing lines up, how every action can make a difference. Let's keep going. The third stroke. The USS Nautilus delays the Japanese destroyer Arashi. Now, in general, submarines did very little to contribute at Midway. The submarine force was really still recovering from missed opportunities during the interwar period. And Nimitz, Admiral Nimitz himself was a submariner and was generally looking for more from the team. But there's one story worth noting. USS Nautilus, under the command of Lieutenant Commander William Brockman, was one of only 3 submarines from Task Force 7 to make contact with the Japanese during the battle. But the actions of her crew undoubtedly played a critical role in the eventual outcome. On June 4th, Nautilus had been attracted to the location of the battle, attracted to the Japanese fleet by the signs of smoke that had come from the first U.S. aircraft to attack. You heard about that attack from Admiral Cox from Midway. And the submarine tried repeatedly, over and over again, to attack the Japanese, but with very little luck. She was initially strafed by a Japanese fighter, bombed by a Japanese float plane, depth charged. And once she went deep during the depth charges, once the depth charges stopped, Commander Brockman came back to periscope depth to try and engage the enemy with torpedoes. Fired on the Kirishima with 2 torpedoes. One of the torpedoes got hung up in the torpedo tube, and the other one missed. An indication of the big problem the submarine force was facing at the beginning of the war. And his tenacity for re-engaging was rewarded with yet another blistering barrage of depth charges, 2 of which clanged off the Nautilus, the bow of the Nautilus, physically, just bounced off it without exploding. In the meantime, while the Nautilus was tangling up these cruisers and destroyers, the battle force, the Shido Butai, had steamed off to the northeast. And a single destroyer, the Arashi, was assigned to stay behind and just take care of this pesky Nautilus. And once done with that mission, or rather, I think the Arashi just gave up in frustration, she made best speed to catch up with the battle fleet. She pointed towards the carriers and went ahead flank, pointing like an arrow towards the main battle force. And this is where we find ourselves now with the 4th stroke of luck. Because overhead at that time, at about 7 o'clock, well, actually a little bit later, at 7 o'clock, Admiral Spruance had launched air groups from both Hornet and Enterprise to attack the carriers. The Hornet air group, led by Admiral Stanhope Ring, had departed on course well north of the group. The Enterprise group, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had nearly met the same fate. But just as this destroyer was taken off to regain the strike force, right overhead was Commander McCluskey with his 33 plane dive bomber strike. They had initially overshot the Japanese, were running very low on fuel. And Commander McCluskey basically had a choice to turn back towards Enterprise or to take a shorter and maybe safer option to land on Midway on the island. But just at that time, that decisive moment, he looked down, spotted this destroyer, and using all of his creativity, he figured, you know, I'm going to bet that that ship is heading right back towards the main battle force. He flew right along the course of the Arashi. His instincts were correct, and McCluskey set course using the wake as his beacon. And at 10:20, his strike group encountered Carrier Division 1 and commenced dive bombing. Almost simultaneously, Yorktown's more experienced dive bomber squadron attacked Carrier Division 2, the 2 carriers to the north. These attacks themselves were enabled by incredible bravery of naval aviation. 70 U.S. carrier-based attack aircraft were lost that morning, 37 of 41 torpedo bombers, 21 dive bombers, and 12 fighters. 40% of the planes involved that morning were lost. But as those dive bombers came over the Japanese attack force almost simultaneously, in the next 5 minutes, 3 carriers were reduced to flaming infernos, and the course of history was changed forever. Now, in conclusion, if you think about it as a series of just strokes of luck and attribute the victory at Midway to a miracle, I mean, it's very tempting to do that. But as with all things, great teams make their own luck. It was the toughness of the shipyard and the sailors on Yorktown that brought her to the fight and kept her there at the front and center of the effort from start to finish. It was the cleverness and the tenacity of Team Hypo, Rochefort and Layton, informing Admiral Nimitz of the Japanese plan. It was the boldness of Admiral Nimitz to use that intelligence and with a sense of calculated risk, take the initiative and commit his forces to Midway. And I might add, as a Washington person, Washington was nowhere near that decision. Right? He went against Admiral King. It was the fighting spirit of the CEO of Nautilus who tangled up that Japanese destroyer that eventually pointed Commander McCluskey to the carriers. It was the skill and the toughness of the Marine Corps defenders on Midway that had inflicted so much damage on the attacking aircraft, essentially paralyzing the Japanese strike force from attacking the carriers as they rearmed their plan. And it was the eternal bravery, the skill and boldness of our naval aviators that closed the attack against great odds with inferior aircraft and never deviated from their mission. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, CEO of Torpedo Squadron 8, told his men, "If only one plane is left, I want that man to go in and get a hit." And that is exactly what his team did. And that's why we still revere the names like Waldron, Gay, McCluskey, Best, and Thatch. And in the end, as Admiral Cox said, Yamamoto, the Japanese commander, had it all wrong. Arrogant from his victory at Pearl Harbor and their winning streak in the first 6 months of the war, he had determined that the Americans lacked the will to come out and fight. How wrong he was. How very wrong. Today, look around you. The men and women of the U.S. Navy continue to draw inspiration from our greatest generation, especially these Midway survivors with us today. Our sailors serve with the same integrity, accountability, initiative, and toughness, and they give their best at every effort, including giving their lives if called, because one never knows what will be the decisive action that makes the critical difference at the end of the day. And perhaps the greatest miracle, the greatest outcome of this battle is the peace that has persisted since that war, and the strong alliance, the lasting partnership, and close friendship that has emerged between the United States and Japan. It is this combined team, the combined team of all the nations who fight every day for our freedom, that continue to guarantee the stability, freedom, peace, and prosperity for all in the Pacific. And as I close to this terrific group on the Midway, and Mac, I got to tell you, the ship looks absolutely fantastic. We're going to celebrate, we're going to commemorate today. We're going to think deeply about what that day meant 75 years ago today, what it means to us today. And at the end of the day, as you lay down, I'd ask that you just say a quick prayer for all who fought at Midway. Those who have passed at Midway, at the battle, those 307, those who have passed since the battle, and those who are still with us today. And say a prayer also for all of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines deployed around the globe guarding our peace. Thank you all. God bless you. God bless the United States Navy, and God bless America.
Well, I've had the great honor of sitting up here for every one of our keynote addresses, and I think that was absolutely the finest capturing of what the essence of the Battle of Midway is. And, you know, even I learned about the submarine piece, which you would expect me to do that, listening to a CNO that's a submariner. But it's the same issue with the aviators, the surface warfares, and the submariners. You know, that they should have never even showed up for this thing. Lousy equipment, outdated, outgunned in all the ships, outmanned in the carriers, airplanes that couldn't even hang with the enemy. And so how do you win? Admiral Richardson shares a miracle, and he identifies the miracle is the young men and women that continue to serve in this greatest Navy. And that is really why we celebrate the Battle of Midway. And that is why we expect all of you Midway veterans to be back here for the 76, because I don't know what we'd do without you. I would also like to recognize and thank the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Its conservation efforts not only preserve our Navy history at Midway, but turn the sacrifices made there 75 years ago into a refuge long into the future. The following video was produced by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and tandem stills and motion showcases the dramatic scenery, history, and wildlife found at Midway Atoll National Wildlife Refuge and Battle of Midway National Memorial. Attention to the screens for the video.
When Pearl Harbor got attacked, we got attacked. All I could hear was gunfire. The kids came back and they were being shot down by Zeros just as quickly as you could pick them out, and we had these binoculars so you could see them. And I watched one young man bail out of a plane. The Zeros took care of him while he was hanging from his parachute and machine gunned till he was dead. Been 70 years since I've been back there. My trip back to Midway was the most delightful thing I've ever done in my life. Really, it's because I'm remembering these kids who gave their lives to us. And they gave me a whole life, gave me 95 years. And if they hadn't done that, I wouldn't have got to have a beautiful wife for 70 years, wouldn't have had children and things. I think it has to be retained in some manner.
Isolated at the far western end of the Hawaiian archipelago lies a pale ribbon of sand, fringed by an ancient coral reef. It is a sanctuary hidden over the horizon. From Hawaii looking west, it sits in the last of the sun at the edge of night. Where, according to Hawaiian legend, souls are born, and upon death, return. Human history and natural history live here side by side. Once the site of a great World War II naval battle, Today, a bird's eye view reveals abandoned runways that are now home to the latest generation of flyers. Over blue lagoons, vibrant corals, and hundreds of resident dolphins. This is a story of change and restoration. A portrait of an island's past and future, and a journey to understand the importance of a lost atoll in the middle of the Pacific. Midway Atoll was the site of 2 attacks during World War II. The first strike came at the same time as Pearl Harbor.
On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards.
Similarly, Midway was relatively unprepared, though it remained in America's control. President Roosevelt addressed Congress the day after the Pearl Harbor attack and asked for a declaration of war against the Empire of Japan.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Last night, the Japanese attacked Wake Island. And this morning, the Japanese attacked Midway Island.
Midway, because of its communications and it's this forward outpost of the Hawaiian Islands, it's absolutely vital to American security.
The war was now global, and the fate of democracy hung in the balance. 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan once again had the strategically positioned Midway in its sights. However, this time it was different. American intelligence broke their secret code and set the perfect trap.
Up until the Battle of Midway, Japan had been continuously advancing. They had never been stopped. After the Battle of Midway, they continuously were falling back. And Midway is that point where everything changes.
On June 4th, the Battle of Midway began. And by June 7th, American forces had dealt the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare, and the turning point of the war.
The Battle of Midway is over. Our front yard is safe, but a big job is still to be done. Day after day, our patrol planes search for survivors. Every tiny coral reef, every distant mile of sea. Search for men who fought to the last round of ammunition and flew to the last drop of gas and then crashed into the sea.
Air raid sirens sounded, notifying us that the Japanese were en route. The Japanese would probably try to take the island, and we trained for that. And we were ready. We had an attitude we could meet any adversary. The old tradition of being a good Marine, why, that was prominent in our everyday thoughts. The enemy is going to die, not us.
I don't think I really thought how important it was going to be. What you concentrate at that period of time is where you live and who you live with and what your job is.
We didn't know the details. We didn't know what we were going to do. We knew there was going to be problems, but all you're doing out there is circling.
About the only feeling I can remember of the actual attack was the vibrations from the bombs following. sounds of the planes diving and machine gun fire.
At 4 o'clock, the torpedo bombers came in. And I heard the lookout say, there's wakes on the starboard side, meaning that he had spotted the torpedoes in the water, and the Hammond sank in about 4 minutes. Around 5, we saw these splashes in the water, and we thought it was material falling off the flight deck because the ship was listing. And the sailor was firing this 20-millimeter gun at the ship to get attention. And all he had on was a life jacket. He was holding his guts in his left hand and pulling the trigger with his right hand. And I'll never forget, because we came aboard, and that was on the 4th of June, and he died on the 7th of June. And that was when the battle actually ended, when we left to come back to Hawaii.
During my visit in 2012, one of the items that stood out prominent to me was the memorials that had been erected to the men that did not return from the Battle of Midway. I never could go back to Eastern Island because none of my friends returned that day.
Today, you can still feel the ghosts of the Battle of Midway among the ruins. In the buildings, which are being reclaimed by the salty sea air and the passage of time, we can still hear the echoes of our history. On the beaches sit relics of a dramatic past. The story of Midway is the story of sacrifice and commitment.
Midway goes beyond just saving Hawaii, goes beyond the valor of those men. They saved the idea of democracy. And today, both the sacrifices and the conservation story today can inspire the world.